Yeah, it's going. Do it.
In 1926, a young mechanic named Fred Duesenberg stood in the engine bay of a racing car at Indianapolis Motor Speedway, staring at something that shouldn't have existed. The engine in front of him produced more horsepower than anything else in America, more than Cadillac, more than Packard, more than any luxury car manufacturer had ever dreamed of putting in a road car. And Fred Duesenberg had built it with his own hands. This is the story of the Duesenberg Straight 8, the most powerful American engine of the 1920s and 1930s. It powered cars that made Rolls-Royce look modest. It won races that everyone said were impossible, and then, in the span of just a few years, it vanished completely, taking an entire era of American engineering with it. Along the way, we're going to see innovation that was decades ahead of its time, a family of immigrant brothers who out-engineered the entire automotive world, and the brutal economic forces that destroyed everything they built. So, let's begin. But first, who exactly were the Duesenbergs, and how did two bicycle mechanics from Germany end up building the greatest American engine ever made? Friedrich and August Duesenberg arrived in Iowa in the 1880s, just two more German immigrants looking for work in the American heartland. They had almost nothing, no money, no connections, no formal engineering education. What they did have was an obsession with machines that bordered on the pathological. They started with bicycles because that's what you did in the 1890s if you wanted to learn how things moved. They built frames, they raced, they won. And somewhere along the way they discovered that they had a gift. Not just for building machines, but for making them faster than anyone thought possible. By 1903, the brothers had moved on to automobiles, and they were already developing a reputation. Their engines were different, lighter, more efficient, more powerful. While other manufacturers were still figuring out basic reliability, the Duesenbergs were already thinking about performance in ways that wouldn't become standard for another 30 years. I mention this because it explains everything that came later. The Duesenberg brothers weren't businessmen who hired engineers. They were engineers who reluctantly dealt with business. Every decision they made was about making the machine better, not about making money. This would prove to be both their greatest strength and their fatal weakness. Now, to understand why the Duesenberg Straight 8 mattered, you have to understand what American engines looked like in the early 1920s. Most luxury cars used variations of the same basic design. You had your cylinders, usually 6 or 8 of them, arranged in either a straight line or a V configuration. You had your camshaft, sitting down low in the engine block, pushing valves open through a complicated series of push rods, and rocker arms. It worked. It was reliable. And it was slow. The Duesenbergs looked at this arrangement and decided it was fundamentally wrong. See, every time you add mechanical linkages between the camshaft and the valves, you add weight. And weight is the enemy of speed. At high RPM, those heavy push rods start to float. They can't keep up with the camshaft anymore. The valves don't open and close when they're supposed to. The engine stops making power. The solution was obvious, at least to the Duesenbergs. Move the camshaft up to the top of the engine, right next to the valves. No push rods, no rocker arms, direct actuation, an overhead camshaft. This was not a new idea. European racing engines had been using overhead camshafts for years. But nobody in America had ever put one in a production car. The manufacturing was too complicated. The precision required was too high. The cost was astronomical. The Duesenbergs didn't care about any of that. In 1920, they introduced the Model A with America's first production overhead camshaft engine. It was a straight 8, 260 cubic inches, producing around 90 horsepower. That doesn't sound like much today, but in 1920, the typical luxury car made maybe 50 or 60. The Duesenberg was in a different category entirely. But here's the thing about the Model A. It was just the beginning. Fred Duesenberg looked at that engine and saw all the ways it could be better. more displacement, better breathing, more power. And he spent the next several years figuring out how to achieve it. The racing program was where all this development happened, because when you're trying to beat the best drivers in the world at Indianapolis, you learn things fast. You learn what breaks, you learn what works, you learn what limits you didn't even know existed. In 1924, a Duesenberg won Indianapolis. In 1925, they won again. The engines were getting more powerful with every race. 200 horsepower, 250, numbers that seemed almost fictional for the era. And Fred Duesenberg was just getting started. In 1926, a man named Arat Laban Cord changed everything. Cord was not an engineer. He was a salesman, a financier, a man who understood that making great things and selling great things were two completely different skills. Cord had already taken over Auburn Automobile, turning a failing company into a profitable one through sheer force of marketing genius. Now he wanted something bigger, something that would cement his reputation as the man who built the finest automobiles in the world. He bought Duesenberg. This could have been a disaster. Most acquisitions like this end badly for the engineers. The money people come in, cut costs, compromise the product, and destroy everything that made the company special in the first place. But Cord did something remarkable. He told Fred Duesenberg to build the greatest car ever made, regardless of cost. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, just make it the best. Fred Duesenberg took that mandate and ran with it. The result was the Model J, introduced in 1928. And the engine inside it was the masterpiece of American automotive engineering. Start with the basics. It was a straight 8, meaning 8 cylinders in a row. This configuration allowed for perfect primary and secondary balance, meaning the engine ran smoother than any V8 or inline-6 could. No vibrations, no harshness, just silky mechanical precision. The displacement was 420 cubic inches, which translates to about 6.9 liters, massive by any standard. But displacement alone doesn't make power. Breathing makes power, and the Duesenberg engine breathed like nothing else on Earth. Twin overhead camshafts, not one, like the Model A, 2. One camshaft operated the intake valves, one operated the exhaust. This allowed for more aggressive valve timing, bigger valves, and better airflow than any single cam design could achieve. 4 valves per cylinder, 32 valves total. This was 1928, remember. Most American engines wouldn't have 4-valve heads for another 60 years. The result? 265 horsepower. Think about that for a second. The typical luxury car of the era made maybe 100. The Duesenberg made almost 3 times that. It was so far ahead of everything else that it almost seemed unfair. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, here's where it gets even more interesting. Because 265 horsepower wasn't enough for Fred Duesenberg. In 1932, the company introduced the SJ, same basic engine, same twin-cam, 4-valve architecture, but now with a centrifugal supercharger bolted to the front. The supercharger forced more air into the cylinders than atmospheric pressure alone could provide. More air meant more fuel. More fuel meant more power. 320 horsepower from a production car in 1932. To put this in perspective, Ferrari wouldn't match that number for another 25 years. The Duesenberg SJ was the most powerful production car in the world, and it would hold that title for decades. But power was only part of the story. The engineering sophistication went far beyond the headline numbers. The crankshaft was a work of art. Fully counterbalanced with 5 main bearings, machined from a single billet of the finest steel available. It cost more to manufacture than entire engines from other manufacturers. The connecting rods were tubular, drilled to reduce weight while maintaining strength. Every rotating component was balanced individually, then balanced again as an assembly. The result was an engine that could rev smoothly to redline without a hint of vibration. The lubrication system was pressure-fed to every bearing surface, with a capacity that could handle sustained high-speed driving. The cooling system was engineered for maximum efficiency, with a radiator large enough to dissipate the heat from all that power without breaking a sweat. And the sound. I wish I could make you hear it. A Duesenberg at full throttle was like nothing else. Deep, authoritative, mechanical. The sound of precision engineering at work. Owners described it as music. They weren't exaggerating. Now you might be wondering what it cost to own one of these machines. The answer is more than almost anyone could afford. A Model J chassis alone, without a body, cost $8,500 in 1929. That's the equivalent of roughly $150,000 today. But that was just the beginning. The bodies were custom built by the finest coach builders in America and Europe. Murphy, Durham, LeBaron, Fagoni, names that commanded prices to match their reputations. A complete Duesenberg could easily cost $20,000. Some went for $25,000 or more. In an era when the average American worker made around $300 a year, a Duesenberg cost more than 15 years of wages. Only the wealthiest people on earth could afford one. And that was exactly the point. E.L. Cord understood something about luxury. True luxury isn't about features you can list on a brochure. It's about exclusivity. It's about owning something that other people can't have, no matter how much they want it. The Duesenberg wasn't just a car. It was a statement. It said, "I have arrived. I am among the elite. I am someone." The celebrities understood this immediately. Gary Cooper owned one. Clark Gable, Greta Garbo, Mae West, Howard Hughes, who was obsessed with speed and engineering, owned several. These weren't just transportation. They were accessories to fame, mobile monuments to success. The European royalty understood it too. King Alfonso III of Spain, the Aga Khan. Royals who had access to the finest Rolls-Royces and Mercedes-Benz and Hispano-Suizas chose Duesenbergs instead, because the Duesenberg was better. And that word, Duesenberg, became something more than a brand name. It became an adjective. When Americans wanted to describe something as the best of its kind, they called it a doozy, short for Duesenberg, the ultimate compliment. But here's the thing about building the best car in the world during the greatest economic catastrophe in history. The timing couldn't have been worse. The Model J launched in December 1928. The stock market crashed in October 1929. And suddenly, all those wealthy customers who could afford $20,000 automobiles found themselves with rather different priorities. It's not that the Duesenberg suddenly became less impressive. The engineering was still the best in the world. The craftsmanship was still unmatched. The performance was still decades ahead of the competition. None of that changed. What changed was the world around it. Sales collapsed. Not just for Duesenberg, but for the entire luxury car industry. Cadillac's sales fell by 80%. Packard barely survived. Pierce Arrow went bankrupt. Marmon disappeared. Stutz faded away. The Great Depression didn't just hurt luxury car makers. It almost eliminated them entirely. E.L. Cord tried everything to save his empire. He introduced the supercharged S.J. to generate publicity. He created shorter wheelbase versions to reduce costs. He explored every possible way to keep the doors open and the engineers employed. But there was only so much that marketing genius could accomplish against economic gravity. Production slowed to a trickle. In the best years, Duesenberg had built maybe 500 cars annually. By 1935, they were building perhaps 50. And then, in 1937, it was over. The Cord Corporation collapsed under the weight of debt and declining sales. The Auburn factory closed. The Cord car, E.L.'s personal automotive statement, ceased production. And the Duesenberg works fell silent for the final time. The last Model Js were assembled from remaining parts. The final supercharged engines were installed in their chassis. The gates closed. and the greatest American engine ever built passed into history. Fred Duesenberg never saw the end. He died in 1932, the same year his supercharged masterpiece debuted. A car accident. The cruel irony of an engineer who spent his life making machines go faster, killed by speed itself. He was 55 years old. His brother August survived longer, dying in 1955. He spent his final years watching the automotive industry he helped create move in directions he never anticipated. Mass production, cost-cutting, compromise, everything the Duesenberg name had stood against. There were attempts to revive the brand, of course. In the 1960s, in the 1980s, various entrepreneurs tried to resurrect the Duesenberg name. They built prototypes, they generated press releases, they promised a new era of American luxury. None of it went anywhere. The moment had passed. The original straight-eight engines survived in their original cars. Because those cars, the Model Js and SJs, became the most valuable automobiles on Earth. Not just expensive, priceless. Museum pieces, objects of reverence for collectors who understood what they represented. When a Duesenberg crosses the auction block today, it sells for millions. 8 figures, sometimes more. A single car now worth more than the entire company earned in its best year. And what of the technology? The twin-cam, 4-valve architecture that seemed so exotic in 1928. It eventually became standard across the automotive industry. Every modern performance engine uses some version of what Fred Duesenberg perfected 90 years ago. He was just too far ahead of his time to see it become universal. The supercharging technology found its way into aviation engines during World War II, where forced induction made the difference between air superiority and defeat. American aircraft engines owed more than a little to the engineering principles that powered those thundering straight-eights. And the pursuit of excellence for its own sake? That survived too. In companies like Ferrari and Lamborghini and Bugatti and the modern hypercar manufacturers. The idea that some machines should exist simply because they're the best that human ingenuity can create, regardless of practicality or profit. That's the Duesenberg philosophy, carried forward by people who may never have heard the name. The straight-eight configuration itself faded away. After the war, V8 engines proved cheaper to manufacture and easier to package under lower hoods. The inline eight's perfect balance couldn't compete with economic reality. By the 1950s, they were gone from American production entirely. But for that brief window between the wars, before the Depression crushed dreams and the conflict that followed reshaped the world, the Duesenberg straight-eight represented everything American engineering could be. Power, precision, ambition, excellence pursued without compromise or apology. 2 bicycle mechanics from Germany built the finest engine their adopted country ever produced. They did it through obsession, through perfectionism, through a refusal to accept anything less than the best. And when the world changed in ways they couldn't control, their creation vanished with them. That's the tragedy of the Duesenberg. Not that it failed, but that it succeeded so completely at exactly the wrong moment in history. The engineering was perfect. The timing was catastrophic. They called the best things in life a doozy because of what that name represented. And maybe that's the legacy that matters most. Not the surviving cars, precious as they are, not the auction records or the museum exhibits, but the idea that once in America, someone looked at the best car in the world and said, "We can do better." And then they did. And that is the story of the Duesenberg straight-eight. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments, had you heard of Duesenberg before this? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.